If given the chance, would you kill Hitler? You've probably encountered this question at some point in your life, either on a Reddit thread in your history class or at an especially nerdy dinner party. But back when history's most hated man was still alive and kicking, there were more than a few folks who answered that question with a definitive yes. In fact, depending on how you count them, there were as many as 40 assassination plots on Hitler's life. And on today's deep dive, we're taking a look at the plots that made it furthest in their execution, and how surviving those attempts affected the Fuhrer's psyche. In the summer of 1934, shortly after his rise to the chancellery, Hitler began a violent purge of the SA, the often violent paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party also known as the Brown Shirts. This was ostensibly to prevent a coup, but was more likely a consolidation of power by eliminating perceived threats to the SA and the German military. This attempt would later become known as the Night of the Long Knives, and it specifically targeted the leadership of the SA, as well as other anti-Nazi and political rivals. One of the men executed in this purge was the head of the SA, Ernst Röhm. The political and military might of the SA was severely curtailed after this purge, and was essentially replaced by the SS under Hermann Göring. But not everyone was happy about this change, and one SA member, Heinrich Grunow, vowed to take revenge on Hitler for the death of Ernst Röhm. Now, Grunow was uniquely placed to take action here as he was one of Hitler's bodyguards, and so he was very familiar with Hitler's movements. As such, he knew when Hitler would be returning to his beloved retreat at Botched and the exact route he would take to get there. Grunow set himself in a position alongside a narrow, winding section of the road that would force Hitler's car to slow to 15 miles an hour. When the car rounded the bend, Grunow fired 3 shots into the man in the back seat. Then, believing he had killed Hitler and wanting to avoid torture from the Gestapo, Grunow turned the gun on himself. A paranoid Hitler, however, had been driving the car and had placed his personal chauffeur, Julius Schreck, in the back seat. Schreck died from his wounds. And while we don't know exactly what Hitler's thoughts on this particular assassination bid were, we do know that the act was covered up and that the Nazis listed Schreck's cause of death as sepsis brought on by a tooth infection. This attempt no doubt fueled both Hitler's paranoia and his belief in his providential protection. Maurice Bavaud was a 25-year-old Swiss student studying at a Catholic seminary in Brittany, France. He became convinced that Hitler was a threat to Switzerland, Catholicism, and was, in his own words, the incarnation of Satan. Bavaud believed that it was his spiritual duty to remove Hitler from history's great chessboard, and in 1938 he began to track Hitler's movements. He settled on his moment during a parade in Munich to celebrate the Nazis' failed beer hall push of 1923. Bavaud's plan was very simple. He would pose as a Swiss journalist, take a seat in the grandstands with a good view of the parade route, and when Hitler passed in an open car, he would pull a gun from his pocket and open fire. Simple or not, the plan didn't work, because as soon as Hitler came into view, the crowd rose to their feet and offered the infamous Nazi salute, obscuring Bavaud's view and any chance at a shot. Undeterred, Bavaud purchased expensive stationery and forged a letter of introduction in the name of the French nationalist leader Pierre Tétanger. He traveled to Berchtesgaden and, using the letter, told Nazi officials that there was a second letter that he was to deliver directly to Hitler. He was told, however, that Hitler was still in Munich, but by the time Bavaud made it back to Munich, Hitler had left for Berchtesgaden. Having spent all of his money on his travels and supplies, Bavaud attempted to stow away on a train to Paris, but was caught in the act. And when police discovered a gun and details of Hitler's movements on Bavaud's person, he was handed over to the Gestapo and tortured into confessing. Ironically, rather than cover up this bumbled plot, the Nazi propaganda machine declared Bavaud the Swiss assassin, and made it sound as though Hitler had narrowly escaped death. The neutral Swiss government refused to intervene in the case, and even purportedly turned down an offer to exchange a German spy for Bavaud. Bavaud was executed in May of 1941. Needless to say, security around the Fuhrer was tightened after this incident, making it far more difficult for a member of the public to get close to Hitler. At the same parade where Bavaud had hoped to take out Hitler was another would-be assassin, a man named Georg Elser. Elser was a German carpenter and a committed communist who thought Germany was in terrible shape, and believed the only way to improve things was to get rid of its leaders. Elser had been at the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall the night before watching Hitler give his annual speech celebrating the failed beer hall push. Elser figured his best chance to strike would be at the same event the following year. He hoped not to just take out Hitler, but other top Nazis too. To do that, he knew he needed more than just a gun. He needed a bomb. Now, being a carpenter, Elser knew nothing about making bombs, so he spent the next 9 months teaching himself how to build them. Using materials and explosives he lifted from his jobs at a munitions factory and quarry, Elser built several prototypes. He tested these makeshift devices in his parents' orchard until he had one he was confident would do the job. Elser then rented a room in Munich and started his preparations. For 35 days, he stuck to the same routine. He would dine at the Burgerbrotkeller at 8 p.m., pay his bill at 10 p.m., and then hide in the building until the staff left. Once the coast was clear, he'd come out and work on hollowing out a column close to where Hitler was going to give a speech. This column was a key support for the balcony above, and Elser hoped his bomb would not only take out the Fuhrer, but also drop the balcony onto any other Nazi bigwigs in attendance. On November 6th, just days before the anniversary of the beer hall pushed, Elser placed his bomb in the hollowed-out column and set the timers to go off during Hitler's speech. He covered up his work and left the beer hall to make his escape. But the border crossing, which had been lightly patrolled the previous year, was now heavily guarded, and Elser was caught by a German patrol while trying to cross into Switzerland. While he was in custody, his bomb went off, bringing down the beer hall's balcony and ceiling. The explosion killed 8 people and injured over 60. None of the victims, however, were Hitler. The Fuhrer had finished his speech early in order to attend a meeting with his military leaders and was already on his way to Berlin when the bomb exploded, missing the blast by just 13 minutes. Hitler would later claim he had a strange urge to leave the beer hall early, which he saw as a sign of divine intervention. He told photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, "The fact that I left the Burgerbrotkeller earlier than usual is corroboration of Providence's intention to let me reach my goal." According to Roger Morehouse in Killing Hitler, from this point on he would only become more trenchant in his beliefs, more convinced of his own opinions, and more contemptuous of the advice of others. He was slipping into megalomania. And no doubt, Goebbels' propaganda machine reinforced this idea of divine protection for Hitler, and letters from world leaders, including one from the Pope, congratulating him on his survival, added to his sense of invincibility. As for Georg Elser, he wasn't executed right away, but was sent to Dachau concentration camp for the rest of the war. The Nazis likely kept him alive in hopes of finding other conspirators. Elser insisted he acted alone and was finally executed just weeks before Germany surrendered. Major General Henning von Tresckow had seen Hitler as a threat to Germany for years, and had surrounded himself with like-minded officers who called themselves the Black Band. And when Hitler visited the Eastern Front in March of 1943, the men decided the time had come for a regime change. The initial plan was that, while at a lunch conference with Hitler, the conspirators would all rise from their seats at a signal and simply shoot Hitler and anyone who tried to defend him. The plan was called off at the last minute, however, when another officer convinced the men that the German people would not react well to a military coup. Tresckow then quickly came up with a plan B, one that would give the conspirators some cover. He convinced one of the officers returning with the Fuhrer on the plane to pack a carton of Cointreau in his luggage. Tresckow told the unsuspecting officer that the triple sec was payment for a lost wager he had made with a German official back at headquarters, but in reality, the bottles contained plastic explosives and a timed fuse. Tresckow hoped that the destruction of Hitler's plane would be attributed to an attack from a Soviet aircraft, and thus shift the blame of his death to the enemy. But Hitler's plane landed safely back at headquarters in East Prussia, and Tresckow had to scramble to retrieve the Cointreau before the bomb was found. Once the package was safely back in the hands of the conspirators, it was discovered that the timed fuse in the bottles had frozen in the uninsulated cargo hold of the plane. Tresckow and his conspirators would make another attempt on Hitler's life later that same month when Hitler visited a display of captured Soviet equipment in Berlin. Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, an officer working for Tresckow, volunteered to carry a pair of bombs under his coat that would detonate while he was giving Hitler a tour of the equipment. Just before Hitler's scheduled arrival, Gersdorf triggered the timer on the bombs, but Hitler rushed through the tour in an astonishing 5 minutes and was gone before the bombs detonated. Gersdorf luckily managed to defuse the bombs mere seconds before they were to explode. Although unaware of these assassination attempts, Adolf Hitler grew increasingly paranoid and drastically tightened his security. Officers were prohibited from carrying sidearms around him, and junior officers were banned from meetings unless specifically summoned by Hitler. These measures thwarted several plots by Tresckow and his co-conspirators, pushing them to execute the most famous attempt on Hitler's life, the July 20th bomb plot. Hitler rarely left his Eastern Front headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. Of all the conspirators, only Claus von Stauffenberg had direct access to the Fuhrer, making him responsible for the next assassination attempt. This plot, however, extended well beyond merely killing Hitler. Upon his death, the conspirators planned to blame his assassination on a clique of unscrupulous party leaders and implement Operation Valkyrie. Initially, Operation Valkyrie, a plan approved by Hitler himself, was designed to quash any internal uprisings from German civilians or forced laborers with the Territorial Reserve Army of Germany. Tresckow had modified the plan to seize control of German cities, disarm the SS, and ultimately remove Nazi leadership. With Hitler dead, the conspirators hoped to take over the German government and military, and do it all while appearing as if they were merely following Hitler's pre-planned orders to address a national crisis. On July 20th, Stauffenberg was invited to attend a meeting with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, and he arrived with 2 bombs hidden in his briefcase. Before the meeting began, Stauffenberg slipped into the bathroom and activated one bomb's timer by crushing its pencil fuse. However, he was unable to prepare the second device before being called into the conference room. Once inside the room, Stauffenberg placed the briefcase on the floor near Hitler. A few minutes later, Stauffenberg was called out for a planned phone call. He exited the room, leaving the briefcase behind. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. Assuming Hitler was dead, Stauffenberg rushed to Berlin to oversee the execution of Operation Valkyrie. Convinced their plan had worked, the conspirators began making their moves, issuing an order to remove any remaining Nazi leaders from their various posts. But, spoiler alert, Hitler was in fact not dead. The conference table's support leg had shielded him from the worst of the blast, and when news of his miraculous survival spread, Operation Valkyrie collapsed. The following morning, Hitler addressed the German people, stating, "The bomb has exploded 2 meters to my right. One of those with me has died. I myself am completely unhurt." He again interpreted his survival as confirmation of his destiny, declaring, "I regard this as a confirmation of the task imposed on me by Providence to continue on the road of my life as I have done hitherto." Hitler's retaliation was swift and brutal. Stauffenberg and several conspirators were captured and executed by the end of the day. Tresckow committed suicide the next day. Over 7,000 people were arrested, and those deemed most responsible were executed by hanging with piano wire. Their executions were filmed, and Hitler reportedly spent hours watching the footage. Even those with only indirect knowledge of the plot were considered traitors. Erwin Rommel, the renowned Desert Fox, was implicated and chose suicide over facing a Nazi tribunal. By the war's end, nearly 5,000 people were executed in connection with the plot. But despite all his bluster about divine protection, Hitler's paranoia and fear continued to deepen, and in January 1945, he retreated into the Fuhrer bunker deep beneath Berlin. He would remain there until the war's end. As the Allies closed in on Berlin and Hitler's officers refused his orders of counterattacks, Hitler flew into a rage. When he discovered that his right-hand man Heinrich Himmler was trying to negotiate a surrender with the Allies, Hitler declared him a traitor, and then ordered that his SS representative Hermann Fegelein be taken out and shot. This was even though Fegelein was his lover Eva Braun's brother-in-law. Finally, on April 30th, after realizing that Germany was defeated, Hitler did what no one else, despite their best efforts, had managed to do. He took his own life.